we're spending a lot of time on wide row corn, and part of that is because I mean we see it a lot on Twitter. I mean, so to be honest, farmers are getting ideas on Twitter, researchers are seeing what's happening. We want to make sure that we address wide row corn and get you the most information we can about it. But I also think that whether you widen those rows out or you use the cover crop mix that's within those rows after wheat, or you apply it to some other place in your farm, you don't have to go. Nobody has to go out and widen their rows on their corn to take something away from the session. If they think about it in the context of, okay, I'm gonna focus on the mixes that they're using within those wide rows. How could that maybe apply to after our wheat harvest? What could I use on 30-inch row spacing to make this practice work to get cover crops established? I think there's a lot of information you can pull from it without having to be interested in wide row corn, to be honest. So let's dive into those that you met through the videos. Briese with Centrol Ag, he's with us on this panel. Kelly Cooper with NDSU. You didn't get to meet Kelly. I referenced him because Kelly's been doing a lot of this work on 60-inch corn down at Oaks, and I never got to make it over to Oaks to interview him. But we also have Mike Ostlie from Carrington, NDSU Research Extension Center, and Joel Ransom from NDSU. So maybe let's just dive right into it. I think there's going to be a lot of questions. We already had a couple come up on the screen. So I think, maybe the place to start with all of this is what should a farmer focus on? And I think, Mike, you talked about that a little in your video, but maybe we'll go right to you for your thoughts on farmers and what they should focus on with this practice.
For me, when I'm thinking about somebody that wants to get set up on this strategy, the key, I think, is to do a little bit of experimentation first and to see what works. But the most natural fit that I see with this system is for those people that have livestock. It's a really great way to get additional value out of the system, because as we kind of indicated with, I think, most of the videos you saw, we're not expecting to match or exceed what the standard row spacing is going to do. And, I think for most people, that may not sit very well. Again, depending on what they want to do with it. But, if you're able to add that livestock component on your operation, it's a really great way to capture maybe some of that gap that you might see with the straight grain corn profitability. So, I think that's probably one of the biggest considerations right there is if you have that ability to add that livestock, I think it's going to pencil out a lot better than if not.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And Lee, as a trusted advisor, as working with farmers as they're adopting some of these new practices, what do you recommend they focus on?
I'm with Mike on this, and I think that for the livestock grower producer, it's much better. The guys that I had, most of them were just trying to see if how close could we get to the regular 30-inch spacing yield. Yeah, and we didn't do real well with that. And I think we still need to learn some things about it and try it again. It's a 1-year deal. So yeah, again, go back to your basics. What are you trying to fix? What do you need to manage? For me, the thing about weed management's really critical. I think that has to be a specific consideration when you're trying to put a lot of covers in this. It really changes your weed control options, and I think you're going to need to be careful with that.
Now, if you're going into this, obviously you need to plant the best possible corn crop you can, to get the most yield out of it, but then also have that cover crop component. And Joel, I know that you did some work on, you alluded in your video that you did work on populations. And what kind of information do you have or things do you want to share about the actual planting of the corn in the wide rows?
Yeah, I think initially I had, this question, if we're going to go to these wider rows, what are we going to do about the plant population? If we keep our same population, we're going to basically double the amount of seed in a single row. And so, that was one of the factors we initially decided to look at. And I alluded to in the video, I was kind of concerned about standability. Once you get up to that 72,000 plant equivalent in a single row, you can imagine that those plants become a bit spindly, and there's a concern there. But certainly in the research that we did this year, that maintaining population really became important. I think we on average in the 2 sites that we had about a 13% reduction when we went from 30 to 60-inch row and maintain population. But if we if we kept the within row spacing the same, when we went from 30 to 60, we actually gave up 35% of yield. So, I think that was a critical finding that I certainly like to share.
Yeah, it's great to have those numbers to hang your hat on, because I think as most people are adopting these practices or trying them out on their farms, they want to know what they're in for, and they want to know, what is the research telling them as to the potential for yield loss, or can they achieve the same yield? Now, if we go between the rows, let's talk a little bit about the cover crops that we may put in there. We saw a lot of variety in what was being used between rows. So maybe, Kelly, you can talk a little bit about what would be selected for cover crops, or what maybe has done well. And you have 2 years under your belt of this type of research.
This has really been a fun project. We've been working with soil conservation for about 15 years. My old friend Joe Brecker got me started on this with a phone call a couple years ago about looking at 60-inch corn. And of course, the really exciting thing was Joel wanted to do the 365-day live rut. And this is the way to do it. So in order to do this, picking a cover crop is going to be especially important. And haven't really got in too much on the details of the various cover crop mixes, is just to kind of generally take a look at them and see what kind of looks good to me. We haven't had a chance to do grazing. One of the things with buckwheat, the first year we did this, buckwheat was kind of the star. We had like 7 other varieties. We had oats and rye and barley, I believe it was. There was some mustard, clover, alfalfa, and buckwheat. And this buckwheat just exploded. We had buckwheat that was like 4 or 5 feet tall. We had pollinators in there, just looked absolutely beautiful. Well, okay, we come to 2020. I had corn on corn in some of those areas, and buckwheat is the gift that keeps on giving. I had buckwheat to start with right out of the chute, hit it with Roundup to burn it down. That killed the buckwheat, but guess what? Another flush of buckwheat. Came in with Laudis, atrazine, and Roundup again, killed the buckwheat. I come back in about 5-6 days, here's more buckwheat coming. Another shot of Roundup, killed that buckwheat. I ended up with buckwheat at the end of the year. So that could be a good thing, could be a bad thing. We did 9 different trials. It was kind of like every nook and cranny I stuck in 60-inch corn in some way or shape. And one of those was a cover crop demo. And what really kind of struck me was that the mix that Mike came up with was just basically the radishes, turnips, and lentils. That came out of the chute really fast, as brassicas do. And I like that quick ground cover for weed control, because I was quite worried about the weed control. Another study we did, well, it was 10 acres. It was just a long story on that, but the cover crop in there was, we had brassicas and grass, and then we got a hailstorm August 24th, and that was just like a weed whacker came down the rows. Pretty much just mowed everything to the ground, but the brassicas seemed to recover the best. So we thought we were going to have pretty good grazing out of the deal, and then we had like 8-degree temperatures in October, and that pretty much laid the brassicas down to the ground. They'll take a lot of cold, but they won't take 8 degrees overnight. So kind of like I said, I could go on and on with this, but that's enough.
Well, good. We've got a lot more time, so looking forward to that. Lee, I want to ask you, I know, I think Joel had alluded to maybe like a 35% drop in yield with this system, and you had, mentioned that it wasn't, you weren't real happy with the results. How does that compare with what you were seeing?
Yeah, we were saying the same thing. We lost 20 to 25 bushels, right around that 17 to 20% on this deal. It was a very significant loss on that. And yeah, and I don't know that the way that we did it was as competitive as having a full cover crop. We had 1 row of soybean in the middle, and the soybean was small and late and didn't really do much of the corn at those critical stages. So I'm not thinking it was a competition issue. I think it was strictly a row spacing issue. And so I don't know. Be careful if you're trying this. Keep it small.
So Lee, I want to keep on you for a little bit with some of the weed control. So Kelly was mentioning that the buckwheat just kept coming and coming and coming because it went to seed the prior year. What, as a consultant, what would you do for managing that system, or what would your perspective be on cover crop going to seed between the corn rows?
Thank you, Kelly. I'm not planting buckwheat in this scenario. It's right there. That's something we needed to know, is that that's not going to work. And one of the things when we test buckwheat and some of these other cover crops with certain herbicides, you find out that a lot of the HPPD group actually does not control buckwheat for very long. It can kill it when it's up, but the residual control is not very good. So there's things like that. There are certain cover crops that'll fit in these systems that allow you some herbicides, but yeah, keep that in mind. My intent on this is to try to keep the seed production low, and buckwheat can be very prolific, especially if it's 4 feet tall. You're gonna see it again, Kelly, I'm pretty sure, for the next couple of years. So that type of thing is important. The weeds are critically important. Like I said in the video, you're gonna have diversity, but it's not gonna be what you want, and it's gonna be very aggressive, and they'll take advantage of things. And our weeds are better adapted to low light, low moisture, and hot conditions than most of our cover crops. So keep that in mind, that they have the advantage in this system.
Yes, I know, Mike, you talked a little bit about the herbicide options you had and the cover crops you chose. And so what else did you incorporate into that herbicide program, or how you're going to manage weeds in your system?
Again, I agree completely with Lee in that when we're doing this, we really need to think about how we're going to manage the weeds as well as the cover crops. And I think this is a really neat system because, as far as what we have for cropping systems that allow us to incorporate cover crops, this is really turning out to be probably one of the most flexible options we have in North Dakota. And that's because that allows us to go in there with one or some, maybe even two if needed, herbicide applications in our corn post-emergence before we even plant the cover crop. And so that allows us to not only get that nice cover crop coming up when those temperatures are warm and they're going to pop quick, but it also allows us to start with a clean slate in the corn. And so we're doing some more work to try to figure out what some of those best combinations are for cover crop and herbicides as we go. I know Lee's working on that as well. And hopefully we'll start up another big project here this next summer to get a better feel for that. But I think that should be one of the first things to consider. But the good news is with corn and a lot of the products out there, there are a lot of good options for keeping a short-term residual herbicide on the ground and being able to still get pretty good cover crop growth after that. So again, I really see this as a strength of the system, and that we're more flexible here than I think in almost any other cropping system we have in North Dakota.
Right, now I think all of you alluded to some, benefit to grazing these cover crops between the corn rows, because you're going to get a really nice establishment. And I know, Joel, you've got some numbers on that as far as the biomass production of those cover crops between rows on 60-inch and also 30. Could you share some of that information?
We did collect biomass, and as I mentioned, that the cowpea kind of became the dominant, although all of the species that we planted did survive. I was expecting a little more out of the millet because it was such a nice warm season. We had plenty of moisture to kind of sustain things. But, in the 30-inch, at one of our locations, we only had like 200 pounds of biomass at the end of the season. And at the same location, we picked up 1,000 pounds to 1,200 pounds of biomass. So, we're seeing a 7-fold increase. So, if you're serious about having some biomass, this 60-inch obviously gives you an opportunity to produce some biomass.
And just keeping with you, Joel, there for a minute, we have a question from the audience about variety selection here. Should we select a more upright variety of corn, and how can variety flex or fixed ear affect the response of the corn in 60 inches?
Yeah, indeed, those are important questions. I think it also kind of gets to the fact how complex shifting to this kind of system can be, because we're talking about weed control, we're talking about fertility, we're talking about populations, and now we're talking about hybrids. And we obviously just used a single hybrid. I think using a flex type hybrid obviously would be to advantage. I was expecting a little more flex out of the hybrid we used than we got. And as far as, an erect type versus a floppy ear type, those would be really good questions that would require a lot of research resources to kind of answer. But I think the principles would be, we would probably like something that's going to tolerate being closer together within a row. So something that stands well, has good green snap ratings. Probably something that is more erect is going to be to our advantage, and something that's able to flex. Absolutely.
So let's go to a question to Kelly with, what if you don't do 60-inch row spacing, but you try 40? You know, is that a good middle ground? Would there maybe be less yield hit? Is this maybe even something that you've looked at or thought about?
I think the exciting thing on the spacing is probably the paired rows. Now, maybe you don't want to go that far with the investment. And I know Joe Brecker has been doing that. And of course, I had to follow suit with Joe. I made 2 passes with the planter to come up with paired rows. And that looked like in a couple of the, side-by-side comparisons, that was good for about a 15 bushel yield bump. I think that's going to decrease. I mean, there's less real estate for the cover crop, of course, if you start narrowing those rows, so you might not get as much growth there.
And Kelly, what about timing on the cover crop in the system? Have you kind of worked with different timing there?
I really haven't. Joe and I was just visiting about that yesterday, and of course, from what I'm seeing, I really like to get that weed control as long as I can into the season, and then get that cover crop in just before the corn canopies. But at that stage, I mean, you're really running tight. Like Joe said, you have a breakdown, it rains, you aren't going to be able to get in there unless you have some kind of a high boy system. Now, I've heard people of, seeding just after the corn comes up, and I know in one particular case, the farmer said that was an absolute disaster because he couldn't get ahead of the weeds. Of course, you can prep for that by putting in a cover crop that you can spray over the top of, going with more grasses, and being able to sacrifice the broadleaf component as need be. So yeah, I think there's room for flexibility in the timing.
So I think it'd be worth exploring the row orientation, and I know, Mike, you had all your plots, and it looks like you had a mess of plots out there. You had a ton of them, but you had them all in different row orientations. And so maybe, Mike, can you talk a little bit about what you found out of the north, south, east, west orientations?
Well, not as much as we hoped, frankly, if I'm being, but so, and again, the whole concept there is that we know the further north we get in latitude, the more we have to think about the quality of light. And in, for instance, in orchard settings, when you go further north, you tend to get more yield out of north-south row orientations. But again, those are wider yet. So, yeah, we had these comparisons, hoping that this would kind of show that same thing as an orchard, where I kind of called it a corn orchard at that point, because you have such wide alleys and you're doing something else in the middle compared to the sides. But what we found was, in Carrington, we didn't really see much of any impact as far as row orientation goes. With that early frost we had and dry conditions, maybe we would have saw something different on another year. Oaks, where Kelly was working, it was a little more complicated there. Actually, overall, the east-west rows performed better on both orientations. And so I thought this might be something that we'd see a pretty obvious advantage to, as far as being able to plant north-south and seeing that either better cover crop establishment or better corn performance. But neither of them quite panned out to much, if any, difference. So
let's go maybe to some of there's a question here about a guide or a chart for cover crops and safe herbicides. And I know that Lee, both you and Mike have information on this, but let's start in the field with Lee, because I know your herbicide and cover crop plots were right next to your 60-inch corn. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what you saw in the field, and then we'll go to Mike for some of the greenhouse work.
Okay, so yeah, was the second year that we've been doing this, and I'm just basically using the normal mixes that my farmers are using for the weeds in this region, in this area. Yeah, I'm trying to separate out some of the individual components, and then we plant the cover crops right across those and just kind of see what happens. And we did several different timings. We did it at, day 1 after planting, and planted 7 days later and 14 days later and 21 days later to see if the residual would break down and we'd have differences. The thing that I've seen in the last couple of years is that there's less effect on the cover crop than anticipated. There are certainly some cover crops that do not get along with the herbicides, and that's pretty easy to see. And actually, if you look in the North Dakota Weed Guide or your local state weed guide, it's going to tell you some of that stuff. Your rotation restrictions to some of these crops or sister crops or some of the type of stuff. Like things that you kind of knew were going to happen. And then a few surprises happened. Like the buckwheat really did well under a lot of the HPPDs. I wasn't expecting that, but it did. So I think we need to continue doing that. I'm not ready to publish this herbicide is safe on this cover crop kind of thing. I don't think I'm ready to do that at all. But what I would say in general is that within 14 days of your herbicide application with residual products, we had less effect on the cover crops than I thought there would be, even though a lot of them were injured. But again, it's a secondary crop. So I'll take weed control with cover crop injury. That was okay for me.
I know Mike had come down and visited your plots, and I remember we were talking about all some of the input that he had from being down there. And so, Mike, are there some things that you've picked up from greenhouse work or any work that you've done at Carrington on herbicides and cover crops?
Yeah, so it's something that I'm pretty excited about, and we're, as I mentioned earlier, we're trying to build this database to put out some tools for people to be able to compare. And I know there are some resources out there if you search corn cover crop herbicide tolerance or something along those lines, there's some other pretty good tools out there for from other parts of the country that will be a little bit useful. Maybe they don't 100% apply here or not, but we're building our own database. And but I'll kind of echo what Lee said a little bit in that there's a lot of things you can apply to your corn that seem to be okay on a lot of cover crop species that you maybe wouldn't expect, and so when a lot of these herbicide labels are written, they're kind of written with a cash crop performance in mind. And so, there'll be a lot of times when you might see a little bit of injury. And if that cover crop were to be a cash crop, you might be reducing your yield, but that doesn't mean it's not still functional as a cover crop in your system. And so, as we go forward, we'll try to capture, how successful we think that cover crop is going to be with our different herbicide combinations. But and again, it's there's a lot of things that we can say. We know a lot of the grass crops, especially if you look at oats, millet, sorghum, they inherently have a lot of the same tolerances that corn does. And even some of the broadleaf crops like flax works really well with a lot of the same herbicides that you can use in corn. But just to complicate matters a little bit, I talked about how important I think grazing is in the success of the system. You do still have to keep in mind there is a difference between planting a cover crop and then planting a crop that's harvested by cattle as far as herbicide labels go. And so you do still have to keep in mind there are sometimes restrictions on grazing and whatnot if you are planning to actually graze your cover crop after applications. So it's a complicated system.
I forget that all that information on herbicide restrictions and grazing is in the weed guide. Is that right, Mike?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd consider it a complete guide, but yes, so there are several pages towards the end of the North Dakota Weed Control Guide that do have a lot of those grazing restrictions listed.
Oh, perfect. Since we've been talking about the North Dakota Weed Guide, is that something, Mike, that you could throw up the link to that in the chat so that people, if they want that resource, they can check it out and download it? I know it may be different for other states with people attending from other locations, but I do think that's a very helpful thing for people to have to get started with this.
Yep, sounds good. I'll do that.
Perfect. Thank you. So I think we're talking a lot about cover crops, grazing, silage. I heard a little bit of, Mike, you were saying something about sorghum in there as being a good fit possibly. And Lee, I'll go back to you first and then we'll go to Kelly on this. But I know that you've worked with a grower who was going to graze them or maybe harvest the corn for silage and had some sorghum in there, I think, on one of his fields. And so maybe there's something that you pulled from that work or ideas from that?
Yeah, we did. The grower had a 30-acre chunk that was silage corn, and we did 60-inch rows on it. We did plant grass cover crops in there. The idea was to have cool season and warm season. We wanted the warm season to give us a bunch of biomass, and we wanted the cool season to be underneath and give us a little bit of green at the end of the year. So we had the 60-inch rows. We did go north-south on this one. And then we had some cereal rye in there, some millet, and some sorghum Sudan grass. And so that did several things. It left a number of herbicide options open, like Kelly referred to and Mike talked about. It did help us manage weeds in that system. There were several options for us. We did get pretty good growth on the sorghum. It got taller than the corn by a strong foot. The millet, I'm going to echo what Joel said. That was a little bit disappointing. Came up really nice, and it just didn't quite do what I intended it to do. And then the rye came on strong early on, and even though it was hot, and then we got really dry. So we had this small rye plant that is not very tolerant to drought. And millet and sorghum Sudan grass both are quite tolerant to drought. We got dry, and the rye was just not big enough to survive. So it actually did not make it through the season for us. It got too dry, I think, and that died off. So in the end, we had some pretty decent corn in there. We had a fair amount of millet and sorghum Sudan grass. But I just don't know if we had as much biomass gains as Joel said, and that just could be.
Let's go to Kelly on that, because I know, Kelly, I've been standing in a field with you before that was, I think it was just 30-inch row spacing on corn, but it had the sorghum Sudan grass in there down at our friend Joe Brecker's, or his cousins. And so I don't know if you have some thoughts on that too, as far as that type of system with sorghum Sudan and corn for silage or other resources.
Yeah, I didn't put any, none of our cover crops had sorghum Sudan this year. They were the cool season grasses and some of the brassicas. I know in theory it sounded really good for silage. I do remember, I think it was a grower in South Dakota had used millet and sorghum, and they thought it had suppressed the corn yield more because of similar demands of nitrogen at the same time. So I guess kind of depends on what you're going for, you know, the corn yield or the grazing. And I think that'll be a really, as we go down the road with this, figuring out which corn varieties and, you know, matching, you know, what if you're going to cut it for silage, if you're going to graze it, you know, how you're going to do these things. Like our 10-acre piece this year, when he turned the cattle out in there, our cooperator, when he turned the cattle out in there, they were quite happy grazing what was left of our frozen radishes and mowed out grass. But I think just other, I've heard of even flown on cover crops in corn, you know, not getting really established very well. But I remember the grower said, I can't believe how the cattle are surviving out there when I can't see anything. But he says they go out there every day and they come back happy. So I guess that's where we'll really find out how this works, is when we get cattle turned out into systems.
We do have a question here I wanted to direct to Joel. A question about maybe doing a wide twin row. So with planting 2 30-inch rows and then having 60 inches on each side, is that something that might improve the success of the system, in your opinion?
Well, you know, I think anytime we can get more corn area out there, it's going to help increase the corn yield. And so when you twin row it, you tend to have a bit more corn. You're going to give up some, you know, you're going to give up some area that the cover crop's going to establish and grow in. So, you know, I think you're always going to have the trade-off. I think the biology is such that, you know, you can only produce so much with the amount of sunlight that's out there. And so depends on what's capturing that sunlight.
Yeah, it seems like there's all kinds of ways you can modify the system to make it customized to your operation. And we do, like Tim said, we do have a couple questions in here on corn chopping and equipment there. And I think we will save those for the farmer panel because Chris Wahlberg could answer some of those questions. Is there anything else? Should we do a last round? And then I think we could even just go into the farmer panel while you guys stay maybe in the chat and answer some questions on the research aspect.
Yeah, great.
So let's go around and give you guys an opportunity to share something that maybe that we didn't ask. And I'm taking a page out of Tim's playbook from yesterday because this was such a great way to wrap up sessions. And so let's start with Mike. Are there any things that we didn't cover or ask you about that you wanted to make sure people knew?
So, you know, I think out of the rest of the members of this panel, we saw the least amount of yield loss here, but you know, we kind of started out with pretty low yields compared to what we were hoping anyway. So here we were looking at about a 5 to 7% yield loss by going to 60-inch rows. So maybe a little more manageable than some of the the 20 or 30 bushel losses like the others were saying. And I guess from my perspective, I still see a lot of potential in the system, and I think if we kind of work on more so on the input management and try to economically make the systems a little more equal, maybe we don't have to get up to that same yield and still make it pencil out just as well. So I think from my perspective, I think we'd be successful on this strategy if we could consistently get to about 90% yield of a standard row spacing. And we have some more work, I think, to be able to get there, but I'm still pretty optimistic, and I think that there'll be a fit for this in some people's operations.
And Mike, what is next for you in your research on this? What question are you asking yourself that you can't wait to try to answer next year?
Yeah, certainly, as I mentioned, we're going to look at herbicide tolerances, and then also I really want to focus in on some nitrogen placement, especially, and try to work with again not just flat nitrogen rates, but looking at some of these more banding and mid-season applications. As far as being able to better take use of the fertility that's out there. And then after seeing all these questions, we did fix up our old one-row corn chopper last year. And so maybe try to incorporate some more grazing or silage questions into this in the coming years too. We'll see.
We're seeing that flywheel in real time here. I love it. The chat is guiding the research, which is guiding the chat. This is awesome.
It is awesome. I love seeing that happen too. And so let's go to you, Lee. What are some of the major things that you want us to take away, or things that we forgot to cover from what you're learning?
So I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about what I think we can do, but yeah, I think these guys have really covered it. My thing is just be cautious, take your time with it. My next purchase on this is, I don't know that you need a whole quarter of corn at 60-inch rows. My interest on this is actually taking some of those marginal acres, some of that marginal ground, where what we've been doing anyway is reducing the plant population to manage our resources a little bit better. And I wonder if we couldn't do something in those areas where the yield expectations are lower anyway. We're in that 100, 125 bushel area of the field. I'm thinking that we could put cover crops into that and boost the grazing potential on that whole system, or actually maybe target some of those challenges that are in that spot. Maybe it's a saline spot. Maybe it's excessively wet spot. Maybe we could put the rye there and manage that challenge for the next year and be part of our system, so that we're expecting a yield hit there anyway. And if we take a little bit of a yield hit, that's fine. But if we're actually helping fix that soil in that spot for the coming years, then I think there's a lot of value even outside of livestock. So rather than on a whole field basis, I want to look at it in small spots.
Great. And we're starting to get more questions now. That's good. This is how it happens. So let's go. I want each of you to be able to share those things first too before we ask these questions. And so, Kelly, are there things that we didn't ask you, or that you want to make sure we cover?
One of the trials that we did this year was our corn performance trial. We had 25 different varieties. So we did a 30-inch and we did a 60-inch. Now this wasn't replicated right within the same trial. There were two trials side by side. And when it was all said and done, the 60-inch yielded 95% of the yield of the 30-inch. Now, some of those varieties, I was just looking here, 216 bushel in the 30-inch, 214 bushel in the 60-inch. Obviously, that's a variety I'd like to look at. However, Lee and I were discussing this yesterday or a couple days ago. Varieties change so fast, so I don't think we can hang our hat on a variety, but we need to look at traits, and that's one of the things I want to focus on. If we can find traits in the corn, that's going to work out better for this. One of the other things that we noticed, this was just side by side, going corn on corn, planting in between the 60-inch was no yield difference than old 30-inch corn that was worked up. I was hoping that 60-inch wide would be enough to make the corn think it was on non-corn ground, but it didn't look like that just from this very limited trial. Another idea I had, I planted 60-inch corn, strip tilled it through the weediest spot that we have on the site. And I got to thinking, this is a little bit contrarian, but I was able to go in there with my four-wheeler and make multiple spray applications. And would there be an advantage to getting an area like that, getting the seeds to actually germinate so you can kill them, as opposed to suppression all the time? So that's, I guess, one of the, one of the other things, we measured stalk diameter between 30-inch and 60-inch. And surprisingly, we didn't come up with any difference. I really thought the 60-inch, at the 3 1/4-inch spacing would be quite a bit smaller stalk diameter, but from what we found in our measurements, not the case.
Well, let's go to Joel, and that's actually a good question too for you, Joel, is the stalk diameter of the green snap that we were possibly seeing. And did you end up seeing that there was a difference between the 30s and the 60s?
Yeah, so we had 2 locations, as I mentioned earlier, and we had green snap in both locations. I suppose it's pretty common, isn't it, in North Dakota, to have enough wind at the right time to have some green snap. And I thought initially that we saw quite a bit more in the 60-inch. So we have, a smaller plant, and maybe you'd expect some of that. But when we actually went out and counted, and of course, green snap within plots usually comes, there's a lot of variability on where it happens in the field. But, we at the end of the day basically saw as much green snap in the 30-inch as we did the 60-inch. And, maybe that makes sense. Green snap is more associated with rapid growth and a healthy plant, and maybe a smaller diameter stalk that's under a little more stress isn't necessarily more prone to green snap, but certainly something to keep an eye on.
And are there other things that we forgot to ask you, Joel, about what you were doing or the research that you had? Or
well, I just wanted to talk about the yield loss again. Tim mentioned that I reported 35% yield loss, and I did, if in fact you kept your plant population or the spacing within the row the same. So, reducing half the population when you went to 60, went to 60-inch row. But we averaged in the 2 locations 13%. And I was a little surprised because, one of our locations averaged about 220 bushel and the other was 150, and to have the same percent yield loss in both was a bit surprising. But certainly the better your crop, the more potential you have for shading out your cover crops, and so I guess you should expect that. You want to do all you can to have a great corn crop, and it probably will reduce the biomass available as a result.
Yeah, there's a question too about that, Joel, about certain cover crops that maybe handle shade better than others, and if you know of any that might do better in that scenario where you have a high yielding corn crop.
I'm still at the stage of I don't have a lot of experience with the cover crops, but I think the grasses typically don't handle the shade as well as the broadleafs in general. Millet, you stick it in a 30-inch spacing, for example, it pretty well disappears. And the cowpea just did phenomenal. And the only reason I stuck the cowpea in there is we had seed, and it was a type that I did not think would produce seed, so we'd have to worry about volunteer cowpea the following year. I think radish as well. My sense is that, when you try to stick radish in 30-inch corn, it doesn't survive well. So I think, that's kind of my observation as far as those that don't tolerate shade. I would say radish and millet would be a couple of examples.
And so sticking on that legume and the end credit then too, let's go back to Mike and ask, can you get a dominant legume like your peas that you interseeded in there, or maybe Joel's cowpeas? Could you have those in there and then get an end credit for the next year? Or is that something that you looked at or could hypothesize on?
Yeah, I think that's generally a pretty good strategy, and I think there may even been a question about sharing during the current season, and I think there's some evidence that you can have a legume growing in the current growing season, and there might be a limited amount of resource sharing then too. But certainly, I think the next season afterward, you'd see the biggest benefit to having that legume, and I think just diversity in what you're growing there, with having the cover crops available to kind of biologically keep that soil active between the rows. fixing some nitrogen, and then putting something where you have that cover crop the coming season. Whether you're doing the offset strategy like Lee was describing earlier, and you're moving your corn rows over a little bit, or just going to a different crop entirely.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit to that, Abby. So we did have the 60-inch rows with 60-inch soybean in the middle there. Yeah, and so we soil sampled that all, independently. So I sampled on the 30-inch rows, on the 60-inch rows, and then on top of the soybean row. And I did see that the 60 and 30-inch row, the residual nitrogen was about the same, right around 19 to 21 pounds. On top of the soybean row, we had 29 pounds of residual nitrogen. So there was a little bit more. We did in season take a look at the roots and the nodules of the soybeans. We did see that they were pink inside. They were actively fixing nitrogen. I do think that there's a potential of it. However, one of the reasons why we get a soybean credit is because of the residue, the different compositions of the residue. And so when you do have that corn residue out there, I think that's going to offset some of that nitrogen credit that we can get. However, I did see a little bit of benefit. We're going to check it again this spring and see if we can still see the measurement. We're planning to move over and plant corn on that and try a little bit of nitrogen rate response on it too.
You guys did an excellent job covering a lot of ground with the research and your thoughts and ideas on weed management, to population, to traits, to cover crop selection. Wow, I think a lot of that can also be pulled from the 60-inch system, and thinking about that in a 30-inch system too, is a lot of those concepts that you talked about. So thank you very much to everybody on the research panel, to Lee, Kelly, Mike, and Joel. We really appreciate that you're doing this work and that you're sharing the information too that you have, even just after 1 year of research. It's great to have that to guide our practices.